from REACHLaw, and yet another webinar coming to you live. And this time we are going to talk about the Turkey KKDIK lead registration process. And this will be the second part of a three-part webinar series. And today we are going to talk about data access, dossier development, provisional registration, which is a new thing, and then the submission of both the lead dossier and before that the provisional lead dossier. So today I have my colleague Sibel Kılıç also on the line. She will join us for the Q&A at the end because she is very busy with KKDIK registrations, as you can imagine. But Sibel, if you are here, could you introduce yourself? And maybe she dropped off. Ah, there we have you.
Yes, hello.
Go ahead, Sibel, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Frederik. Hello, my name is Sibel Kılıç. I am a director at REACHLaw Turkey, living in Istanbul, and I'm responsible for the team based in Turkey. As a background, I'm a chemist and I hold a PhD in organic chemistry. In my career, I've been working on REACH since 2013 and then working on KKDIK since 2017 when the KKDIK regulation was implemented. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sibel. Yeah, believe it or not, but it's me on the left side. Frederik Johanson is the name, partner, head of sales, chemical engineer by background. Been working with REACH and REACH-related topics for a long time. Some would say probably too long, but anyway, here I am, happy to have this webinar on KKDIK together with you. So indeed, this is part 2 of a three-part series. So today we are going to talk about data access, dossier development, and the development of this provisional registration, which is a new requirement, and then submission of these. We had our initial part 1 webinar already in October, the 8th of October, on the nomination part. I will just recap that really briefly before we dive into the nitty-gritties of this part 2. And then part 3, joint registration management, will be held on the 4th of December. So just in a couple of weeks to conclude this three-part webinar series. The agenda is very packed as per usual, and actually this time I with the recommendation from my colleagues just to say that this will take at least 90 minutes this time. So we'll see if we can keep that time. We'll see, but at least it's closer to reality. Anyway, we'll look at just have you provide you a short introduction to REACHLaw for those of you who are new. We'll give you a quick overview of the registration process and KKDIK in general, and give you some updated news, like really new news. Came into like an hour ago, more or less, some of the parts of those newses. So we'll look at that, but then I'll give you a quick summary of this part 1 webinar on the lead registration nomination, because that ties into this webinar, which will focus on this the lead registration process after initiation. So essentially the data access, preparation of the dossier, the CSR, the provisional registration, submissions thereof, and then going to the lead registration action part 2, specific to this content in this presentation. Then we conclude and go to the Q&A at the end. So give you just the really quick snapshot of REACHLaw. So what we do, we provide support for REACH and REACH-like chemical regulations and product regulations globally. So as you can see on the map, we do have offices in many countries, not in the Americas yet, or Africa for that matter, but in the other continents, except of course Australia. But anyway, the main places where we have these REACH-like chemical regulations. So the head office is here in Finland, in Helsinki. For UK REACH purposes, in Manchester and in the UK. We have also a small office in Brussels, albeit that is for servicing EU REACH related topics for the most part. Then we have our, of course, Istanbul office, which is very current for this topic today, and of course where Sibel is calling in from for KKDIK and SEA purposes. Then we have offices in India, albeit they don't have a REACH-like chemical regulation, at least not yet, but where we have in Mumbai and in New Delhi, and then in Seoul for K-REACH purposes, and the newest newcomer is Ukraine, Kyiv, more specifically for Ukraine related topics, so Ukraine REACH, CLP, and all chemical safety, which, by the way, we will next week we will have on the 27th, if memory serves, webinar on Ukraine REACH and the latest developers thereof. So please feel free to tune into that one also. So indeed, we provide compliance services for chemical products and then other products, albeit the chemical compliance part of this product-based, let's say, leg of our service provisions is the biggest, which of course encompasses providing support for chemical regulations such as Turkey KKDIK. We also provide services pertaining to product regulations. India is quite hot at the moment, and then advocacy and sustainability related specific topics. I will not go into them here in the interest of saving a bit of time, but just to nonetheless, just to emphasize that of course chemical compliance is the main thing we do at the moment, and will be the subject of today's, of course, webinar. When it comes to Turkey KKDIK services and of course SEA related services, meaning the CLP in Turkey, so Turkey REACH and Turkey CLP services, we provide, of course, besides being an only representative, we also provide a full set of all services needed to register, pre-register, provisionally register lead dossiers or co-registration dossiers. We help companies manage consortia and the joint submission, meaning like the CIFs, etc. So like it has a CIF management, let's say. And besides that, of course, the usual Turkey STSS authoring and certifications and notifications of these Turkish CLP requirements, etc. So, short, we do everything that is required for Turkey KKDIK compliance, including, of course, all the demanding work when it comes to preparing lead dossiers and submitting these and CSRs, etc., which we will be covering today. So we're one of the leading only representatives service providers globally, and this also now, well, it's been already covered for several years, but also encompasses Turkey KKDIK, as you know already, I think. This webinar recording will be placed on our YouTube channel called REACHLaw Talks. So if you go over there, or if you don't, I'm not providing any links, so you can just go to YouTube and search for REACHLaw Talks, and you will find our channel there. And feel free to subscribe and like our content. That helps other people who may be interested in chemical regulatory topics to find this content also. But at the moment, last count, I think we have 158 videos there, and this will be probably 159 if you are looking at this recording on YouTube. Anyway, we specialize in chemical and product regulatory compliance, advocacy, and sustainability. And before going into the depth of the subject matter today, just wanting to highlight the disclaimer and copyright. So, of course, all the content in this presentation is for general information purposes only. So if you want to have specific consultancy advice on compliance-related topics, etc., then just contact us directly. So we will not accept any like liabilities, and everything is at your own responsibility based on this information in this webinar. So that makes the lawyers happy. Now we can go into the main topics, and I will just discontinue the video feed in the hopes of securing a bit of more bits for the actual content if you are behind a slow connection. Anyway, let's look at the KKDIK registration process as an overview. So for those of you who know this in detail, of course, you can tune out and get a additional coffee because you will probably need it. But anyway, the basic requirements, as with any of these REACH-like chemical regulations, is that substances that are manufactured or imported into Turkey at 1 ton or more annually need to be pre-registered and registered before the applicable deadline, provided they are within the scope of this registration requirement and the regulation as a whole. But as we all know, it's most of the substances are within the scope of both, of course, the KKDIK regulation as such, but also the registration requirement. And that will be the focus, of course, of today. So you can say that it's the same scope as under EU REACH, and also the same no data, no market provision apply for KKDIK, meaning you have to register, provide data to be able to have a market. So basic requirements, again, for these substances subject to registration, there are different tonnage bands, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and over 1,000 ton, depicting the different levels of data required to be included in the registration dossier. Excuse me. And these can be also registered in different types. Typically, you're registering as a full substance with the broadest use case and use conditions of use. But then you can also have these isolated intermediates, whether it's on-site or transported. But these, to be able to benefit from these reduced data requirements, these substances have to be under strict control conditions during the whole supply chain or whole life cycle of that substance until it's turned into another substance. And submissions are done through this KKS system in Turkish language, and we'll look at this in more detail in the coming slides. So in this slide, you will see, try to summarize all these different deadlines, timelines, etc. in one very busy slide. So this now leans upon the previous webinar we had, so you know what a provisional registration is and what is a provisional lead registration. We'll cover that also here in this presentation, but for those of you who are wondering what these are, just have a look at the previous webinar, part 1 of this series. We'll go into more detail on that. But anyway, pre-registration deadline came and went. So it was a couple of weeks ago already. So essentially, you should, if you had placed substances on the Turkish market before this timeline, then you should have had them registered by this date. It is still possible to late pre-register substances that are placed on the Turkish market for the first time after this timeline. So for example, 1st of November, then you can still wait until 30 days has gone to within 30 days, then submit this late pre-registration. I'll touch back based on this pre-registration in a few slides. Then what we covered in the previous webinar in quite detail was that these lead registrants must be appointed or selected by end of this year. So that is the next deadline coming up ahead of us. So watch again this part 1 webinar series on this, because there we cover this into great detail. And then we have this provisional registration deadlines coming up. First, we have it for lead registrants that have not submitted the full lead registration dossier by end of March next year. Then you have to submit a provisional lead registration by end of March next year, containing a subset of the full data that is required in this dossier. This we will cover here in this presentation. But then subsequently, co-registrants that are members of a joint submission or a SIF that want to register a substance that where the lead registrant submitted the provisional lead registration, then they have to be able to co-register eventually by the deadlines. They have to then submit their own provisional co-registration, and this deadline is then end of September next year. And after that, we will actually then get the usual registration deadlines for these higher tonnage band substances, CMRs, very toxic to aquatic organisms, substances, H400, 410 substances. And then we have for the lesser tonnage bands, 28, meaning 100 to 1,000 tons. And then for the two smallest tonnage bands, all the way end of 2030. These we know, these have been available for a long time, but these are new. The essentially these this one on the pre-registration deadline, then the appointment schedule or selection schedule for lead registrants, and then these provisional registration deadlines. These were all introduced with this procedures and principles document we covered in the previous webinar, and actually covered even in more detail in the webinar before that. I believe it was in August on this specifically on these procedures and principles. So have a look at that. It's on YouTube also. So if you look at the timeline, yeah, time flies. The registration deadline passed already, but the ones we have in front of us, the provisional lead registration deadline coming up very soon in 4 months, so end of March. Then the provisional co-registration deadline coming up in 10 months, end of September, and then the first deadline, of course, will be 13. Okay, these are wrong. Apologies. This I think this was 40 months, and this was something in the order of 30. Okay, don't look at those. Sorry for that. Fix it. We'll fix it in the next one. But this one, 30.5 months, is correct. Yeah. Anyway, such is live TV. Anyway, so the joint submission concept applies also in Turkey for KKDIK purposes. So this we know well. So what that means is we have one lead registrant, 0 to many co-registrants. So of course, if you have a substance that only you register, then you will become a lead registrant in that joint submission, albeit there are no other registrants for that particular substance. So the process going from pre-registration to registration, we know this already, but good to just iron out quickly. So of course, first you need to submit, or you hopefully already have pre-registered your substances, because the deadline was already end of last week. When you do that, you become a member of a pre-CEF with other companies who pre-registered the same substance. And once you've agreed on the substance identity, typically that is officially done once the lead has been selected, but you can also do it preliminarily before that. And once the substance ID has been agreed upon, it becomes a CEF. Then in parallel, or before or after, you can, typically it's before, but or in parallel, you must select the lead registrant, and this is the process we discussed in detail last week, not last week, but in the previous webinar. And the deadline, as said, is end of this year, and that is slightly challenging, to say the least. But once that is done, we will prepare the lead dossier for registration, meaning first the provisional registration, and then the full registration to be submitted by the applicable registration deadline, and of course the provisional registration by end of March next year. It's, sorry, I should see 26. A lot of typos here today. Sorry for that. Once the lead has submitted, then of course co-registrants are going to buy a letter of access and prepare their own submissions to submit as part of the joint submission. But today we are focusing on this part, and as said, provisional registration deadline is 26, end of March. So indeed, if you missed your pre-registration deadline by end of last month, then I just recommend doing it as soon as possible and deal with the possible consequences, whatever those are, if any. But as said, late pre-registrations are possible within 30 days if you are placing a substance on the Turkish market for the first time now after this 31st of October deadline. And the KKS system will look at quite a few screenshots of this. It's the system we will be using to prepare the provisional lead registration and the lead registration dossier, but also, of course, as a co-registrant, the provisional co-registration and the co-registration dossier, and of course through which we also submitted our pre-registrations, CLP notifications, etc. But this is like an online hybrid system combining essentially REACHLaw, iEuclid, and the KSR tool in one online system. And it's not possible, unfortunately, to upload like iEuclid dossiers or download any like dossiers for sharing. It's all online. So that is a common misconception I think companies have. It is online and only online. So indeed, after the last registration deadline, which is then end of 2030, all substances that are placed on the Turkish market at 1 ton or more will also have to go through this inquiry procedure. And first get this inquiry accepted and then register, and only once that is completed can they then place this substance on the Turkish market at 1 ton or more. So the process will be very similar to that, or identical, you could say, as that for e-reach purposes nowadays, where you have to first inquire and then register, and then only then, once everything is completed, be able to place the substance on the market at 1 ton or more. And some of the really new news, as I mentioned, alluded to earlier, is that actually, as of just a couple of days ago, the KKS system is now fully functional. So you can also submit dossiers. This was not possible earlier. So you could compile a dossier, you could submit pre-registration notifications, etc., but you could not submit registrations. But now it's possible because they've implemented these templates for this provisional registration feature. And just this morning, we got the announcement in KKS tool about this, albeit we can see earlier that it was possible. And just, I think, an hour ago or so, it was actually published on the ministry website. So you can have a look at it here. I think you can Google it, but if you can also take a screenshot of this link. And we can send it also, this link, when we send out this thank you email after this webinar, for sure. It's of course in Turkish language, but essentially what it says is summarized here. I will not go into details. I invite you to have a look at this on our YouTube channel. You can just screenshot it. But essentially what it says is provides just saying that you can now submit, and it provides information on how to do this provisional registration depending on your case and so forth. So this was the new news, so to speak. And if we look at some statistics, always interesting. So as of just a couple of days ago, we had 3,389 lead registrants for, of course, 3,389 substances available in the KKS system. And then you ask, and one of the questions was, or a couple of questions submitted in advance was, how do we know if our substance has a lead registrant? You should be able to see that in the KKS system, and you can also in the system download a list of all lead registrants, and that's, for example, how we know that there are 3,389 as of a couple of days ago. Albeit we've seen that one big chemical company starting with a B and ending with an F have been denouncing their lead position for quite a lot of substances. So probably this number is maybe not entirely accurate, depending on who picks up that lead position afterwards. So just for your information. Lead registration submissions are still at this number because we suspect that there have not been many submitted now in this 2 days or 1 day since it's been possible to submit. And we're expecting around 15,000 different substances still to be completely registered in the KKDIK registration, by KKDIK registrations. Whether this is truly the final number remains to be seen, but you can see that there's quite a huge gap between 15,000 and 3,300, 3,400. So how on earth are we going to get up to 15,000 by end of December this year is of course a pipe dream. But in most cases, if we look at who has lead register or nominated, been selected as a lead, it's in many cases it's an only representative, or then of course local subsidiary of some big international chemical company. And sometimes we've seen these numbers being shown in various government and other materials, is that they're expecting around 50,000 different co-registrations to be submitted on top of course, these lead registrations for, well, whether it will be 50,000 remains to be seen. I'm maybe a bit skeptical, but anyway, quite a lot of registrations ahead of us. And it's expected that over 10,000 companies will be affected by the KKDIK regulation in the form of having to register substance, pre-register, register substances, etc. So if you look at just the final comparison sheet between EU REACH and Turkey KKDIK, just focus on the differences. Besides all the other processes and requirements, they are equal to EU REACH except for this new requirement as of August, this provisional registration requirement for both lead and co-registrations. And then they have this certification requirement for safety data sheets, which we do not have, and we do not have in the EU provisional registrations, nor did we have them. And then this review by this chemical assessment expert of these dossiers, both the provisional and full registration dossiers. So we didn't have this either in the EU. So these are the main differences that come into play, of course, now that we are going into the practical details of this lead registration work. So as a summary of part 1 webinar, as said, I invite you to have a look at the actual webinar recording on YouTube if you missed it or need a refresher. But indeed, there we cover this the basics of these procedures and principles for KKDIK implementation. So these procedures and principles I'm talking about, which was published in August. So it did introduce this deadline for lead registration by end of this year. So in this webinar, we went into detail how you should nominate yourself, what you need to communicate with your pre-CIF members, and how the pre-CIF members vote for you to become a lead registrant. And you also need to share some sort of at least the topics of a CIF agreement with those companies who are in the same pre-CIF CIF that you are, before you can actually say that you are now the selected lead registrant. And all of this has to, these essentially two steps where member companies are voting for you to become the lead. First is that you nominate yourself in the KKS, and the second is when you share these CIF related agreement topics, they also have to agree on those. And only an absolute majority vote locks you in as a lead registrant for both of these cases. But as said, we looked at this in detail in the previous webinar, so I invite you to have a look at that recording. And for substances that already have a lead registrant by the publication of this procedures and principles, so that was August 12th, but where the lead dossier has not yet been submitted, the lead registration selection may have to be redone if necessary. Very encryptic, but that's what it says also in the document. So I take it that if the nomination wasn't done properly, you didn't have the absolute majority vote clearly, then that could be your role could be called into question, and a selection would be in order. Okay, so what does it all mean? So if you are not yet a lead, then you should become a lead as soon as possible, because time is running out for this lead nomination part. That was the conclusion, more or less, of this first webinar. And now we will pick up where we left off. So we look at the lead registration process after this initiation phase. So now we have here several sub headings under which we will go through all of these step by step. So now you understand why this will probably take 1.5 hours. So indeed, if we look at the lead registration process as an overview, then in the previous webinar, indeed, we looked at this lead registrant selection, and we looked at this substance identity profile definition and agreement process. We looked at some part of the CIF communication, like the SIP, and now in this part 2, we are going to look at data access negotiations and data collection. We look at the EU-REACH dossier review and CSR creation. We look at what information is to be translated. These are quite quick sections, but then we will look at preparing the provisional lead registration and the submission thereof. We will not look at the partial letter of access sales for provisional registration purposes yet, because it ties into also the LOA sales, which is part of this joint registration management part. So that will be covered in part 3 of the webinar series. So you need to stay tuned for that. But we'll go through the mechanics of preparing the dossier, the provisional lead dossier, and submitting that. And look at the fees, etc. Then we'll look at how to compile the actual lead dossier, lead registration dossier in KKS, and how to submit that. The submission process is identical, more or less, and the provisional lead registration submission, except that you will not have to pay the ministry fee again, because you paid it here in the provisional registration step, provided you need to do that, meaning you will not be able to submit the full lead dossier by end of March next year. So we then, for the last webinar series, we will look at all these 3 topics. And by the way, yes, also these blue ones we will be discussing here today. So now you know more or less the scope that we are tackling in this webinar. So indeed, let's look at these data access negotiations, data collection. This is something that has not dramatically changed over the with this, for example, this procedures and principles, etc. So I think you will probably know this to a high degree already, but the recap is nonetheless in order. So indeed, why do we need data? Well, in the lead dossier, we have a lot of endpoints, depending, of course, on tonnage band of the substance and whether it's a full substance or intermediate. But let's say it's a full substance with higher tonnage bands, then yes, and it's classified, then you will need a lot of data to satisfy the basic requirements, to be able to classify and label the substance, to be able to prepare the exposure assessment, risk characterization, and of course the chemical safety assessment as reported in the chemical safety report, and of course to populate these endless endpoints. So provide robust study summaries on these intrinsic substance properties, etc. So to be able to fulfill these critical steps, parts of this, the lead dossier, we will need physical, chemical, toxicological, ecotoxicological information. We can get that by read across in some cases. We need exposure data, etc., to be able to do this. So this is why we need access to data, whether it's whether we need newly generated information to be included in the dossier, or we use existing data that is available from, for example, from the EU REACH lead registrant. And of course, we absolutely recommend that you will use data that has already been generated for EU REACH purposes, for example, because that is readily available. We know the results, we know what it will cost upon negotiations with the data holders, etc., and it's quicker. So I absolutely do not advocate for new testing or anything like that. Use the information that is available. Of course, if for whatever reason the data owner then becomes difficult, then that's another story. But for all intents and purposes in this webinar presentation, we assume that most of the data, if not, well, all of the data that is needed, we can get from the existing data holders. But just as a recap, we do need more and more data the higher our tonnage band goes. Annex 7, Annex 8, Annex 9, Annex 10 for the highest tonnage band. This, of course, intermediates, transported, on-site transported isolated intermediates have very basic requirements, whilst then transported isolated intermediates over 1,000 ton do have also this Annex 7. But here we're focusing on full substances. So you can see that the endpoints increased by tonnage band. If you would have to populate all endpoints, which is typically not the case because you can waive certain endpoints because they do not apply to your substance and the way it's used, for example. But let's say you would have to, then you would have 65 endpoints to populate in the lead dossier for over 1,000 tons, which is quite a lot. We'll look at how to populate these in KKS without going into all the nitty-gritties, but at least you will see what it looks like. So as I said, we assume that most of the data, and based on our experience that we have already worked on lead dossiers, are working on many lead dossiers, this is the case that we will use EU REACH related data from EU REACH consortia, lead registrants, and related data holders. We haven't come across a case yet where we would need to have generate new studies. Knock on wood. So indeed, to be able to use this data, you need to have legitimate access to it. So what this means is that you have to have a license from the data holder granting you this permission to use this information for KKDIK registration purposes. For you as a lead registrant, and hopefully for your member registrants as part of the joint submission, meaning that you get the right to sub-license this information. There are different ways of agreeing to this data. One could be a letter to use, etc. But in all cases, it requires some sort of an agreement to be made in writing between the data holder and then the lead registrant. If we now look at the lead registrant driven lead registration under KKDIK, which we are looking on here in this webinar. And as I said, data is not free for most companies. However, if you own data under EU REACH, meaning you really own it, you don't have just the right to refer, but you own it. For example, you're a member of a consortium, then of course you can use that data for KKDIK purposes also without having to pay for it again. But I invite you to look together with the applicable consortium about those related details, because it depends on the case. But in most cases, indeed, data will be the most expensive component of the KKDIK lead dossier. Not in all cases, but in most, I would say. So indeed, the purpose of having these data access negotiations is that you secure this legitimate access. So what you are aiming for, and what usually is the case if you are buying, is that you get the right to refer. You do not get the full ownership of the data. That is quite rare, but that is enough to have a license for the right to refer to EU REACH, for example, data studies to be used under the KKDIK registration process. When you are as a lead are negotiating access, it is also highly recommended to try to get rights to sublicense, these rights to refer to your member registrants, meaning that when you issue a letter of access, the data you negotiated is already covered in that letter of access for the members who are joining the joint submission. We are going to discuss this part in well, much greater detail, actually quite great detail, in our next part 3 webinar. So I invite you to tune back for that topic there, because it relates to joint registration management and a letter of accesses, data sharing, cost sharing, and so forth. So that will be covered there. Quite heavy topic, as you can imagine. In many cases, when you are getting access to data, of course, the preferred exchange format for this information would be a Euclid file, because it's good standardized way of transmitting the information. And in KKS, we have the same sections as in a Euclid file. So you have the same sections in an REACH Euclid file corresponding with KKS sections that you can then populate from one place to another, of course, going through the review and translation, etc. needed. We'll talk about that. You don't need the actual study reports per se, but only the information that you enter per se in KKS is required in the regulation. So as said, this data will not be free for most companies. And in some cases, you could actually be in a situation where you have to contact a lot of different players or different data holders. For example, if the EU lead dossier was compiled based on other existing data from other companies around the world, then in most cases, the EU lead registrant, for example, or consortium, cannot sublicense their right to refer information to you unless they own it, which is in some cases most likely not the case, or they only have rights to use it for EU REACH purposes. So it can be complicated when you then have to collect breadcrumbs from different data holders across the globe and so forth. So indeed, getting this legitimate access to data is a key activity for success in the K-REACH registration process as a lead registrant in this case. So allocate enough time for that. It will just take time. We've seen this. Sometimes it can go really quickly if the data holder already has preempted these sort of requests. They maybe have them from K-REACH already, etc. Then of course it can be a very smooth process. So it's you will find the full spectrum. So also the data access, of course, have to abide by this. If you are getting this data, for example, from your members as part of the joint submission, or your potential co-registrants, as you are going to collect this information, we'll look at that in a few slides, then this transparent, fair, non-discriminatory data sharing rules apply. But as said, they only apply inside of Turkey. If you are, as you will in most cases, need to access data from outside of Turkey, then these do not apply. The same also pertains to this 12-year data rule. It does not apply for data coming across from different jurisdictions. So, for example, from the EU, where a dossier was submitted 12 years ago already, it does not apply in Turkey. There is no clock ticking also for Turkey, except when the Turkish company lead submits their dossier. Then the time will start ticking for that particular submission and that data. Anyway, I mentioned this, that EU REACH lead registrant may have acquired data from other data holders, so they cannot just siphon off that data to you without you having actual data access right from the actual owners of the studies and the data. So you might have to, as said, collect these breadcrumbs. And but in some cases we've seen, and ever increasing so, many of the EU REACH consortia are also just providing packages for use of data for example, for KKDIK registration purposes, and also providing licenses for the consortium members to use this data for Turkey KKDIK purposes and so forth. But this also adds to the complexity, because you as a lead for Turkey, when you issue letter of accesses, we'll talk about this in the next part, but just wanted to highlight it here. When you then issue a letter of access, of course, the company who purchasing the letter of access only have to pay for what they need. So if they already have access to some of the endpoints in the letter of access, then they do not have to pay for that. So this adds to the admin workload for the lead registrant under KKDIK, because we'll see more and more of these cases of custom letter of accesses, if you will. But we'll talk about that more then in a couple of weeks. So indeed, this the playground, if you will, for these different data owners can be quite complicated. This essentially just shows what we have here, because we are trying to get from the EU REACH registration data, from the joint registration, from the lead registrant, from the consortium, but they might be relying on third-party data owners, so we would need to get information from that, and then from consortia, from new tests, or own let's say member companies joining joint submission, etc. Likely, of course, no new tests are needed, but that's a last resort. So indeed, early in the lead registration process, the lead registrant should then send out an email to all the pre-CIF members, CIF members, for the purpose of collecting data, to check what data is legitimately available from the potential co-registrants of the substance. So you would need to explain why you need this information, what the information is needed, ask then what specific information they have to share, and if they have this legitimate access to this data. It's not just enough that they copy pasted it from the internet or something. You actually have to provide proof of ownership, so that you can de facto provide then a license for the right to refer, or maybe you even want to sell data with full rights. It depends on the data holder, of course. And then, of course, to share such relevant information, endpoint data, with associated costs. Very important, because we need to know what that data will cost, so that we can also allocate those costs into the letter of access. We'll talk about that in the next part 3. I set the deadline. In practice, when doing this, you will not get a lot of feedback, if any. But this is a process that needs to be done by the lead registrant, because then you're ticking at least a box. And the way to collect that is, for example, using templates, data questionnaire, what you have, endpoints, what other endpoints you may have, and access information, etc. So this is, for example, a format that we've used. So once all the information in the CIF have been collected, then the lead registrant would do this sort of a data gap analysis to check what else is missing. And in matter of fact, when we work on these, usually it means that there's nothing coming from the the potential co-registrants, meaning that we have a full gap that needs to be satisfied, and that is done by then acquiring access to existing data from EU REACH, from the EU consortia's lead registrants or related data holders. But if for whatever reasons data is not available for the joint submission, so the KKDIK registrants, then you could, of course, check per endpoint, is there available, do we have read-across information for similar substances? We could check, can we waive certain endpoints because it's not relevant for the exposure profile, not relevant for this particular substance. Can something be modeled? Or do we, as a last resort, have to generate something new in a laboratory? So do tests and new studies. So this is, as said, this last generating new studies is unlikely because usually we are able to satisfy the data needs from existing information, from existing data holders. But if you would not, then this would be the workflow of going through. And then, of course, you will have to pay for that data, and it takes time. I will not go into details here. You can, again, just pause the recording and look at this in detail if you want. But yeah, of course, if you go to the testing, then it costs and it takes time. That's what it says here. So indeed, when you have EU REACH registered already, then of course you have certain benefits, because you may be a member of a consortia that can extend the rights to use this EU data for Turkey KKDIK purposes. If you are in consortium, check with the consortium management. Do you have this right? If you just bought a letter of access from a consortium, then you will highly likely not have this right. But please do check from the consortium nonetheless. You can, as I said, own some information yourself. If that is the case and you have the rights to it, you can of course share it. You do not have to pay for it again. And you can, if you're registered, co-registered, or even better yet, lead registered, of course, then you can use that data as a template for the KKDIK registration, which is usually the case, where we have access to the lead dossier. And of course, you will be able to reuse company-specific information and like analytical information also in this KKDIK registration. You do not have to redo it unless it's your substance ID has somehow changed or the purity profile has changed. And of course, if you've gone through the hoops of becoming through the EU REACH registration, then of course this is not your first rodeo. So then you can take inspiration and learnings from that and take that into this KKDIK registration process. But in all cases, I would say in practice nowadays, you are getting the data from EU for EU REACH purposes. You getting the data access for KKDIK purposes. And the benefit of using that is that, of course, it will be hopefully lower cost. We've seen something, some extravagant cost requests also, but typically, if we have reasonable data holders, then they adjust the costs according to more or less market size. We avoid new tests. It takes a lot of time, costs quite a lot of money. We get the information immediately, know the results. And of course, if we use EU REACH data in Turkey, provided it is good, then of course we will be relying on the same data for different jurisdictions. So there will not be these arbitrage issues between one region having a better dossier data set than the other, which could lead to some problems. So highly recommended to use existing data. But as I said, we will talk about this data and cost sharing part in much more detail in this part 3 joint registration management webinar on the 4th of December, so just in a couple of weeks. So indeed, let's look at the dossier review. So this is the flows 5, 6, and 7 in this process flow we looked at. So what this means is that when we prepare a lead registration, or whoever prepares, you should of course have a look at the data that was included in the EU REACH lead dossier, for example, so that you understand how it was set up, how the different assessments were made, where a CSR was required, understand how that was created. Is it the same data set, which it of course should be, but you need to understand the data you will use in your KKDIK dossier. It's not just a mere copy paste, because for example, if REACHLaw as an OR prepares a lead dossier, checks the e-REACH lead dossier, or wouldn't check the lead dossier or how it's done, then we would not be sure. Let's say the authorities contact us and ask some questions about how things were derived and etc. Then we may not be able to answer that clearly until we've done this investigation. So you need to know what's going into your KKDIK lead dossier. That's the underlying message here, and you need to check this information, understand it, how it was derived, and know what you are then inputting into your KKDIK lead registration dossier, albeit translated. Also for the CSR and exposure scenarios where applicable, there are different ways of doing it. Either you could translate the whole thing from the EU CSR into a Turkish language version, and that requires quite a lot of then translation work. We'll just have a look at that in the next slide, what translation entails. You can also use this KEGDRESS. I don't have a better name for it, but this KSR tool in the KKS system. So this chemical safety assessment and reporting tool. In Turkish, it's KEGDRESS. KEGDRESS. I'll just call it KEGDRESS here on out. It's available in KKS, and of course, you need to populate the lead dossier to be able to use that to populate certain sections of the CSR. It's quite a lot of work, and also in some cases you would then prepare your own exposure assessment and derive your exposure scenarios based on this CSR. But actually, in many cases, what happens is that you do both. You translate, for example, certain parts like the exposure assessment part, and then use the KEGDRESS to prepare these other parts of the CSR. So it's a bit of a mix of both. So it really depends on the case. It depends on how and who does it and what's most efficient, etc. But there are more ways to skin a cat than one. And no offense to cat lovers out there, just to say. So indeed, translation work, that will be quite an intricate part of the whole registration work, the technical work. What this means is that certain parts of this, like endpoint, robust study summaries, these are, and parts of the CSR I discussed, are contextually translated. What this means is that it doesn't mean that it's a word-for-word translation, but it's more that the information comes across properly. That's because we are not looking at needing to have a word-for-word translation. We are looking at translating the essence of the meaning of the text, and of course values are the same in the dossiers. But a lot of actually practical work as part of the lead registration work is actually translation. So that is just good to understand that it will take time and it will cost something, and that is probably one of the least glorious parts of preparing a lead dossier in Turkey is the translation part. So kudos to the people who do this, do the translation work. Okay, let's come to this provisional lead registration and submission. This is because this is new. All the rest, or the previous sections have been, I think most of you know this, or those of you who are working on this from a day-to-day basis know this already. But the provisional lead registration part, the submission thereof is new, and this was something that was, as mentioned, introduced in August as part of this procedures and principles document, clarifying parts of this KKDIK registration process. And this is defined under this Article 10 of this procedures and principles document. And what it says is that this sort of a provisional registration is required for both lead registrants and co-registrants in cases where the lead registration dossier is not submitted by end of March, so the 31st of March 2026, so in 4 months. And it applies to all registration deadlines, tonnage bands. So regardless of if you have your registration deadline in 2030, you will have to submit your provisional lead registration dossier by this time, unless you are managing or already have submitted the lead registration, full lead dossier by this deadline. But in most cases, they will not be able to submit it, which means that in most cases, a provisional lead registration dossier needs to be prepared and submitted by end of March next year. And what information is included in this lead registrant's provisional registration, so the provisional lead registration, it is all of these you see here, also the orange text. So of course, the usual suspects that you have in your basic co-registration dossier, substance identification information, composition analytical information, suppliers, yes, suppliers. You need to provide information on who your suppliers are. Joint submission information, downstream users here, it's just suppliers, but downstream users, but then also information about the joint submission, because that will be defined already at this point in time. And the lead then provides information about the classification and labeling, and then manufacturing use and exposure information. Well, not the CSR, but information about quantities, annual volume, sites, mixture information, use and exposure information. So this use descriptors, etc. we are used to from EU REACH, for example, and users advised against. And besides that, then of course the lead also provides physical chemical information and guidance on safe use, but no CSR, as you can see. And this we will be looking at now in the next slides, how to fill this, populate this in the KKS system. But as said, then the co-registrants need to submit their provisional co-registration by end of September 2026, and submit this information except for the orange text here. I hope there are no orange colorblind people in the audience, but nonetheless, those that have the asterisks are only submitted and also by the lead, not by the co-registrants. And these have to be prepared by the chemical assessment expert, so this KDU. And what is important to understand, and I've been already discussing this a few times, is that actually these registration fees apply. So you are actually paying your registration fee to the ministry as part of when you are submitting your provisional registration. You are not paying it again when you are submitting your final full registration by the applicable deadlines, or however you want to define that. Don't ask me why this is. Maybe they want to have the fees earlier. Who knows? So, like any lead registration dossier or any dossier for that matter, under KKDIK, these are prepared in the KKS system, compiled and submitted through the KKS system by this end of March deadline next year. So if we look at the KKS system, under the substance management menu, where you first have a selection menu where you can then select to create a dossier, and then under this substance management menu, you select here registration, and then you will see this is a new entry here. This wasn't here before. So this is what they've been tinkering with and updating in the KKS system is to include this provisional KKDIK registration function. So you select that one, and then you start populating. You will see a template pop up showing which sections are needed, and we expand upon those. You will see that these are the parts that are required. Actually, this joint submission should also be read. Sorry for the typos. Many typos today, but it should be also read. So you can see quite a lot of information to submit as part of the lead provisional lead registration dossier. And when it comes to this physical chemical properties, then it's Annex 7 related information that you submit as applicable. I will show you when we look at how to prepare the actual lead registration dossier, how you can then add these endpoints per section. It's the same type of system. I mean, it's the same system, it's just two different templates asking for the same information. So the lead registration template will look a bit different in that sense. It will have more data requirements. Anyway, we'll look at that later on, how to add those. So when you start and when you plan for your lead registration work, it's highly recommended that you actually start with these. Plan for populating these, having the data available for these, because you will need these now in the beginning so that you can prepare your provisional lead registration to do that now first and submit it by this end of March deadline, because you will need that now. So why not start with those and prioritize those sections and those data, unless you can get everything in one go, which is also quite common when negotiating data access, for example. So before you submit, I said you need to have this chemical assessment expert have a look at this dossier, check it for completeness, correctness, and they would need to review information about the manufacturer uses of the substance, so the use descriptors, classification, labeling, study summaries, robust study summaries, that these fulfill the requirements. And it has to be then also submitted by this chemical assessment expert. So in the system, they can see that it is a KDU who has then signed off or prepared this dossier. So the submission is pretty straightforward, and this applies also to the submission of the lead dossier, which we will look at separately, except for that we will not be paying the fee, registration fee again to the ministry. We only do it once here as part of this provisional registration step, whether you're lead registrant or a co-registrant. In this case, we're the lead, so we are submitting the provisional lead registration here. So what we do is in this menus, go to registrations, and we select the applicable substance for provisional lead registration submission, and we submit it, and it will go through a technical completeness check in the system, and it will automatically check certain fields, and if everything is okay, then you can go forward with the submission procedure. If there's something that is not correct, then it will flag and you will need to fix that. So once it passed this technical completeness check, then the following these dossier headers, as we call them under eReach, need to be fulfilled. So you need to select the registration type, joint submission, type, lead registration, co-registration, and these are actually, this is an old slide, so it may slightly be changing now due to this provisional registration. But we haven't submitted a provisional registration yet because it opened up to yesterday or the day before that, so we do not have yet the final slide here, but we will get it the screenshot when that is available. And then the joint submission name and registration fees are then automatically defined in the system, and the amounts to be paid are shown on the screen. This is still the old fees, so don't look at those. So then once you've submitted, you will be asked to pay. You will get a reference number, and you need to pay this fee, because nothing will happen until you pay this fee. It will not go forward in the system until they have received the payment. Once the payment is confirmed, then the lead registrant dossier will be going forward in the system for submission and be being considered submitted essentially. And then you will get the CF members will get an email or a notification in the KKS saying providing the lead registrant name, the substance name identifiers, and a provisional registration number. So I said these registration fees need to be paid upon submitting the provisional registration, or if you are submitting a final lead dossier before the end of March next year, then these fees apply to you also. So these were amended in January this year. So you can see still, I mean, these the fees are very moderate compared to the ever-increasing fees we have here in the EU for EU REACH purposes. So with a couple of days ago, the exchange rates, you can see 79, 80 euros for the smallest tonnage band, up to around 1,255 euros for the highest tonnage band substances. So significantly lower than the 30,000 or so that it costs in the EU for large companies. SMEs have discounts, but I've omitted them here because to keep it simple. So once you're paid and the submission goes forward in the submission pipeline, if you will, then the ministry will check this dossier within 21 days, and they will then come back to you if there are any issues, that you will then have a certain timeline to rectify those issues. And then when all is okay, once the provisional lead registration is complete, then the ministry will actually assign a provisional registration number for your substance and a date of the submission. And if I understood correctly, you will have a P suffix to the actual registration number. And this provisional registration number is then used in subsequent communications with, for example, the ministry. So, as mentioned, for these co-registrants then to be able to also submit their provisional registration, they will have to join the joint submission. So it means that already at this provisional registration step, they will have to obtain also legitimate access to some of the information, like the fiscal information that is required to be submitted as part of the provisional lead registration dossier. So what this means is that in most cases, some sort of a partial letter of access will be issued for these co-registrants that will go through the provisional co-registration step, where this full letter of access is not yet available, which is most cases. But we'll talk about this, as said, in the next webinar, December 4th, where we look at this joint registration management part. Now let's have a quick look, and yes, we are going probably over 90 minutes. Apologies for that. If we look at the lead registration dossier compilation, I will show you quickly just what it looks like. It's similar to that of the provisional one, except that you have more fields that need to be populated, and the joint submission is also here, but actually it's automatically given, so it's probably not the big issue, to be honest. So in this example, we've selected the lead registration dossier template for 10 to 100 tons, and it will show you what needs to be populated, and these are identical to EU REACH. So if you tinkered around with IUCLI dossiers, then you are very familiar with this. And here you are also attaching the CSR where applicable. well, in this case, it is applicable because it's over 10 tons. How you then add endpoints is to these endpoint summaries and study records. You select what needs to be the category, you click plus, and then you add this endpoint summary or the study record. You select the file or the summary and study record and enter the name and the summary of this information and click save. So it is very similar to EU Reach in that sense. And once you've done that, you've enabled this endpoint, and then you add the information that is needed. So it will look like, for example, this one here. A lot of fields to fill in. For those of you who worked with this, you know what it looks like, and it's identical here as in Euclid, except that of course everything is in Turkish language. And when you populate this, everything needs to be in Turkish language. Once you've done that, then you save. And as said, in a worst case, you could have 65 of these endpoints for the highest tonnage band substance, albeit in practice, somehow you can always waive certain endpoints. But theoretically, you could have 65 of these to go through and populate, which is quite a lot of work. But then once you've done that, you can then also go and prepare this the CSR in this KEGDRESS tool that is also on KKS. It will pull information from the dossier you created to populate sections of the CSR, and then on top of that, you need to also create the or make the exposure assessment and define exposure scenarios where applicable. We'll not go into this in detail here. It goes into quite a lot of depth, but that's not the point of this webinar anyway. So indeed, also this lead dossier needs to be reviewed, as well as a chemical safety report by this chemical assessment expert. So this is something that has to be done for each lead registration and for these endpoints or these categories here. And that's why, for example, at REACHLaw, we are people at the office with Sibel have this KDU certification, so that they can prepare both the in this case, in the context of this webinar, the provisional lead registration, of course, the actual lead registration, as we've already done for actual lead registrations. So very important. So indeed, if you already paid for a lead registration, let's say you submitted before now end of March next year, then of course then you paid for it already. But if you are submitting the provisional lead registration now, then you will pay for it when you submit, but you will not pay for it anymore. So when you submit the final lead registration, as we just went through, then indeed it will be the fee will be omitted. It's because you already paid for it. So you're not paying twice. At least that is the current status. I don't know what will come up later on. We'll follow that closely, but yeah, I'm not expecting it to mean that you would have to, or there would be some changes to the legislation or whatnot. So indeed, as a lead registrant, it's optimal if you are able to submit your lead dossier at least 6 months ahead of the registration deadline. Because if you go shorter than that, that just means more stress, more hurry for the potential co-registrants to get their act together, buy a letter of access, go through the submission hoops and submit their dossier. So at least half a year before the deadline is absolutely recommended. So that means that there's not a whole lot of time left to actually get things done for the first registration deadline, which is end of next year, 26. So what happens after you've submitted, yeah, the same applies here as for the provisional registrations. I will not go into this in detail because we discussed this already, except that here they will provide the full registration number and not the provisional one. And this is, of course, something you will then include into your safety data sheet and communicate with your downstream users, etc., as proof of compliance, for example. So then registration communication pertaining to all of these topics we've discussed here today. So of course, after this initiation phase we discussed in the previous webinar, then this SIEF communication typically encompasses, as we discussed, information collection for mapping what information is available from companies who are going to register the same substance, so potential co-registrants. So this encompasses physichem, tox, ecotox information, albeit not a lot of information you will be receiving actually when you are, as a lead, are asking for this. You will also ask for registration intentions. Who will actually register, who will not, because we have a lot of course, companies who just pre-register, they will never go ahead with the actual registration. Scope of registrations, uses. Typically, all the uses that are covered under EU REACH is also included under KKDIK or subset thereof. So likely there are no new uses per se, but if there are, we need to collect information about that one, or those ones also, and consider those in the exposure scenarios and so forth. Classification and labeling information. Then the SIEF agreement, we'll talk about this more in the part 3. And of course, you need to also communicate matters related to this provisional registration. It could be that it would be also feasible to scan or get a sense of the intentions to actually provisionally register, co-register from the potential registrants in the SIEF. Because usually I would assume that if you are intending to go ahead with the provisional co-registration, you will also go ahead with the final registration, because you will be paying the ministry fees and some portion of a letter of access likely, if not the final one. So this provisional registration step will also give a strong indication of who actually will go ahead with the registration going forward. Then of course, information about letter of access fees. We'll talk about these updates. And of course, keep in mind that as a lead, this communication and keeping the members up to date on all relevant topics is an ongoing process. It is not something that ends once you've submitted the dossier, because there could be letter of access requests coming down the line in 20 years or something like that, provided of course we still have a KKDIK and the AI hasn't taken over the world or something. We'll see about that one. So indeed, the rest of the lead registration process will be covered in the next webinar on joint registrations of part 3 of 3 on December 4th. So please stay tuned, sign up for that one if you haven't already. I think the invites have gone out already. You can also sign up on our webpage under events. So what that webinar will look like is as follows. We will look at SIEF agreement, law sales, also look at some general communication updates, partial law sales, joint registration management, and lead dossier maintenance. So that will also be a fairly heavy webinar, albeit focusing a lot on the admin part of work, which is of course everyone's favorite. Nonetheless, it will be hopefully also of interest for you guys and gals. So indeed, we're coming closer to the end. Hooray for that. Thank you for sticking by. This will take still a few more moments, and as I said, we have quite a lot of questions, so let's see how many we've had time for. But before that, I just want to go through the lead registration action plan pertaining to this part of this the lead registration process as discussed here in part 2. So from data access, provisional registration to submission. So indeed, if you are starting, if you are the lead registrant, as we tried to push, or I tried to push in the previous webinar, then of course you should start the lead registration work as soon as possible. Don't wait, start now. There's nothing to gain by waiting, especially now that we have this provisional registration step. And expect that the admin workload will be high. I said, acquiring this legitimate access to the data will also take a lot of, in some cases it will take a lot of time. Sometimes it goes very quickly. Depends on the case, but please just be aware that it could be difficult, and previous experience is absolutely of great help, because then you know what you're asking for and know the process more or less. And if you have any questions on that, you can always, of course, feel free to contact REACHLaw. Then when you acquiring this data, of course, preferably have this right to sublicense the data to co-registrants, because it will be just a slightly more straightforward process for data and cost sharing. But if that's not possible, we'll cover that in the part 3 webinar, as said. When you use data, you need to understand what you're inputting into your KKDIK lead dossier and CSR. So you need to review it, go through it, understand where it comes from and why. And most data, of course, is available already from EU Reach, from these data holders. So contextual translation work will be required and is a quite intricate part of the whole lead dossier development process in Turkey. And all this information needs to be translated into Turkish language and then populated into the KKS system and contextually translated. Very important here, not word for word, but the meaning. And I said, we talked about this briefly, but when planning your KKDIK lead registration work, start with the required sections in the KKS that are required for this provisional lead registration, because this is the thing you need to tackle first, because otherwise you will not be able to submit this provisional lead registration in due time, good time before this end of March deadline. So start with that unless you get the whole thing at once, but if not, then start with those. You have a bit more time with the other endpoints that are not required for this provisional lead registration. And also when you come to the situation that you are able to submit your full lead registration dossier, then you should preferably do that at least 6 months before the applicable registration deadline, to allow these companies to have enough time for them to go through the hoops of buying a letter of access, the full letter of access, and compiling their dossier, submitting and paying the ministry, and having the 21 days review for their dossiers. So very important to, as soon as possible. And as a lead, just be very active in the communication, because nothing is worse than being a co-registrant and not having any idea what's going on with the lead, and the lead not communicating anything or replying to anything. That's not good. Not good for image, and not good for you as a company who want to just co-register something. So keep up the communication, document everything, because you need to keep records of everything in case of any issues. And that's very important, I can tell you. Reality check. Indeed, time to act is now, because if there is no lead for your substance now just pick up, how do you say, pick yourself up, become the lead. It's not the end of the world. On the contrary, it probably relieves a lot of stress with you and your fellow co-registrants. Just become a lead now, through you yourself, of course, if you are in Turkey, but through your only representative, if that is the case. And hopefully you have a good only representative, such as REACHLaw. A bit of a shill there. I can't help myself, I'm in sales anyway. So why should I or my OR become the lead registrant? Well, I have a short list here of things why you should consider becoming a lead. And of course, no one wants to become a lead, but still, it is better than this Chamber of Commerce or the ministry together identifying some random, I have it in citations, random company to become the lead registrant that may not have the necessary skills, expertise, etc., to actually take care of the lead registration properly. So it's not a bad thing to actually be in control in these sort of situations. You do not have to be the owner of the data or have the highest tonnage band, because data is available from EU REACH. You can have a lower tonnage band as a lead. Typically, the lead would have the highest, but it is not required. You can also have a lower tonnage band. And then, of course, at the end of the day, when the process has run through, your cost will be lower than those that have a higher tonnage band. Preparing for the lead registration, or preparing the lead dossier under KKDIK, managing this joint registration effort, it's not that big of a deal, to be honest. It's mostly an administrative exercise. It has to do with translation and just understanding the data you have and managing other companies' entry into this joint submission and documenting. So it's a bit like, like bookkeeping in a way. Very administrative, straightforward, but quite administrative, but nothing to be afraid of, for sure. And one thing which is we've noticed with this provisional registration process is that actually now, if you become the lead, and let's say you have your registration deadline for the joint submission is back in 2030, because it's a small tonnage band, you will actually because of this provisional registration process that will run through next year, and by end of September, you will actually be able to already recoup some of the initial investment that you need to do, of course, when you are, for example, using a consultant such as REACHLaw to prepare your lead dossier. But indeed, you will get this reimbursement, starting to get reimbursements already next year. You don't have to wait closer to the actual registration deadline. Say it's in 2030. So that should be a positive thing with the provisional registration process, if we now try to identify some positive aspects thereof. And also, as a lead registrant, very important, your work for the joint submission is also a shareable cost. So this is the sweat equity. So if you spend time in planning and preparing the dossier, collecting information, negotiating, sending emails, etc., this is for the benefit of the joint submission, and this is cost that you can share in the letter of access. So again, money back on your initial investment. And also, one thing to consider is that if there's general reluctance of taking this lead registration position in the pre-CIFs, it somehow signals also reluctance to register the substance eventually. So what this would mean is that if you then go through the lead registration, become the lead registrant and go through the registration process, maybe there are not so many companies at the end of the day registering the substance. What that means is that then your market share in Turkey could become significantly bigger than it is now, when it's a mere pre-registration is required. Because at that point, especially when the deadline has passed, then there are no more free riders. So please consider that also when you consider should you become a lead or not. So, but put simply, just nominate yourself as the lead, because someone has to do it, and time is a bit short. Please feel free to contact REACHLaw on that if you need help. So conclusions, I will not spend much on this because we've now probably hashed this to nausea more or less, but anyway, just be sure to understand that it starts with the provisional registration, lead registration. The deadline is end of March next year. Collect the data you need, become the lead, and REACHLaw is, of course, here to help you in this journey if you so need or want. we're happy to, of course, help. So feel free to contact us, ask for quotation for any parts of the lead registration work or all the work. We're happy to provide it. Now, thank you again very much for your patience. Now we will go to the Q&A. Maybe next time we'll just say that it will take 2 hours instead of just 1.5. Anyway, we have some questions, pre-submitted questions. So I will not go through all of these. I think we will probably have to create a Q&A document because otherwise we will be here tomorrow still. I can see that you also submitted quite a lot of questions in the chat, but I will take a few here just to check if Sibel is still on the line. Sibel, are you there still?
Hi, Frederik.
Hi.
Here I am.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so I'll take a few at random and then we'll just clock out and we'll prepare a Q&A document. I will not promise tight deadline for that, but we'll prepare it because otherwise it will take for long. Anyway, I will take a few strategic ones here, Sibel. So for example, what happens if no lead registrant is declared by December 31st? Sibel, please. I'll rest my voice for a sec.
Yes, Frederik. Thank you. Here, so to say that within the compliance of the KKDIK regulation, the first requirement for the substances at 1 ton or more per year is to pre-register then to have a lead registrant. Then this is a compliance requirement. Then if no lead registrant is declared, then first you have to have already communicated within the SIF. But here, the authority, according to the authority, they said they will be communicating with the top and considering some of the indications like tonnage bound, company size, and they will communicate to appoint one lead registrant. This is a theoretical way to say to respond to this question. Yeah, and we'll see, because there will be, as we alluded to earlier in the presentation, there will be quite a lot of substances that will not have a lead registrant by end of this year. So this is not a unique problem, but of course, just try if there is no lead, just become a lead through your OR or directly where applicable. It's not a big thing. And I'll follow up that question with what happens if the lead registrant does not file the provisional registration by end of March 2026. Sibel, please. Here, if the lead registrant does not file a provisional registration, as said, again, I will start to respond by using the similar answer, but to say as a next, first, to be compliant, then there should be a lead registrant. Then another requirement is to submit a full or provisional registration by March 31st next year. And then if not, this means then you are not compliant with the regulation. Yeah. Again, it is, we will, for the substances you listeners have in your portfolio, just try to avoid this. Become the lead. And I've said this probably 100 times, but that will solve this problem. It's not a big deal, becoming a lead. Okay, let's say I'll take a few more, because I see that we've answered quite a lot of these questions already. Then I'll take the last question on this. My company sells products in Turkey through local distributors who are taking the role of importer for registration. Will they need to submit an inquiry dossier, hence would require data on the substance? So no, not yet. I mean, I hope they have pre-registered the substance, and inquiry is only required after the last registration deadline. So if they haven't pre-registered, just make sure that they do that ASAP. Next, I'll just pick a few, not semi-randomly. Here was question number 11.
How does KKDIK handle confidentiality claims and sharing of confidential business information in joint submissions? Do you, Sibel, want to take this one?
Yes, Frederik. For this part, so to say, there is also in the KKS dossier the sections that you can claim your confidentialities, and these are same as the Euclid's confidentiality claims. Then you can do in similar way also for KKDIK registration dossier.
Yeah, yeah. And outside of course of the dossier itself, if there's some confidential information that needs to be shared between companies, then of course you can have an NDA, or you could have a trustee as a independent third party who, for example, aggregates volume data, etc., and other type of confidential information. The same way we had it for under EU REACH back in the day, for example. So there are mechanisms for this. And I will take a few more questions here. Yeah, question number 50, for example, what is the legal definition of keep this information up to date list of importers, section 1.3? This was the suppliers thing I touched upon briefly, of the provisional registration information requirements. Annual update sufficient, or do we need to update daily? I guess what they mean daily is by when there are changes. So Sibel, do you want to elaborate on this one, please?
Yes, Frederik, here, so to say, there is no written text on this, but to say authority is responding is verbally saying that once the update is in place, you have to update also this in the dossier.
Yes, yes, indeed. Very good. And I'll take this question 20. If we are selected unwillingly as a lead, we don't have any data set to provide in a dossier, what will be our options? Well, it's been covered actually in this presentation quite well. You don't have to own data yourself. We can negotiate access. But I can also add that, and Sibel, feel free to elaborate, but I think no one will be forced to become a lead, even if TOB and ministry then identify potential leads. But I think no one will be forced to take the lead. But of course, someone always has to become the lead. So did I get this correctly, Sibel, that they will not force a lead position upon anyone?
Yes, Frederik, it's correct. The lead role is voluntary.
Yeah.
No one will force, yes.
Yeah. Very good. Let's see, I'll pick just a few more and then we'll call it a quits for today. There was a question about, is there a chance the deadlines for lead selection will be postponed again? The deadline of end of this year and end of March seems too much early to complete the requirements. I agree, it's very tight, but for the time being, no one is talking about any postponements. On the contrary, they are very much pushing for what they have now indicated in this procedures and principles document. And yeah, then we have this, can you clarify which FISCAM data are needed in Annex 1 of the provisional registration? We actually tackled this, so it was Annex 7 only. And I will leave you with this question because we'll tackle this as part of next part 3 webinar. So as a non-Turkish organization, which is an excellent question, by the way, and something that we are dealing with here at REACHLaw. As a non-Turkish organization, we are obliged to comply with EU and US economic sanctions against Russia. How is this compatible with working in a CIF when some companies are represented by an OR and not obliged to share the identity of the company who was appointed the OR? So I'll leave this to linger, unfortunately, until part 3 of this webinar series. So stay tuned. A bit of a cliffhanger there for you guys and gals. I'll see if I can identify one last question from the chat. If not, then I'll just call it quits here. Give me a second. I think we got one question, maybe Sibel, to you. Do we need to inactivate our pre-registrations we have made for substances that are not exceeding 1 ton anymore, if we do not want to be in the provisional registration? So meaning, I guess that if they have cases where they're less than 1 ton and they have pre-registered, should they deactivate those, assuming they are not seeing a trend of volumes increasing? What's your recommendation here, Sibel?
Yes, if the company is seeing also in the future, they are in the near future at least, they are below 1 ton, they can deactivate, and then they can progress in this way.
Yeah, thank you. Last question. This is a short one for you, Sibel. Hi, will there be fines if we are not in compliance? Provided if you're a Turkish company, of course, you will not be fined if you're not in Turkish. But what if a Turkish company is not compliant? What could happen?
Yes, this was also a question for the authority in the webinars, also in the seminars, and they are saying that they started to organize their committee to check this compliance, and then yes, there will be fines for the non-compliance, depending on the case by case they will review, but they will consider the companies to be compliant on the KKDIK regulation starting from the next year. Yeah,
so better be compliant, in other words, and just to be grateful for the person who submitted a question, last one. So this is if the lead has submitted the full registration dossier before March 26, do the co-registrants still have to submit the provisional registration? No, you will not have to. Okay, that concludes it. I'm so sorry for not being able to take all the questions. We'll make a Q&A document sure and distribute with you who attended this webinar. So a bit of bonus for you guys. So if you need help, feel free to reach out. We're happy to help, of course, and stay tuned for the part 3 webinar on joint registration management on the 4th of December. So I look forward to seeing all of you there. And thank you, of course, very much, Sibel, for your input to this webinar, and the folks who are organizing this here at REACHLaw. And of course, the biggest thank you goes to you, the attendees, and people who enjoy our webinars and give us feedback. And as I said, if you have feedback, feel free to send us. We're happy to accommodate. And if you have ideas for webinars, for webinar topics, feel free to share those. We're happy to see if we can do that also. So with that, thank you again, everyone, for listening in, joining this webinar, and I look forward to our next webinar in a couple of weeks. So thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.